It's a great pleasure to have Vikram on this webinar with us. I've known Vikram for a number of years now, both of us based here in Singapore. Vikram is a wonderful commentator on all issues dealing with the economy. He has a great insight, both from the time he spent at the IMF as well as with the Business Times in Singapore and now with the Straits Times, both leading national newspapers, where he writes wonderful articles on the state of the global economy. So we thought it would be great to get him on. Vikram, thanks for joining us. I know you've been quite busy. I thought I'll request Nishith to say a few words. He also has a great perspective on how things are going to change globally post COVID. So Nishith bhai, if you could kick off with some of your perspectives, then I can dive straight into questions to Vikram and to Vaibhav and Ruchir.
Thank you, Vivek, for inviting me to speak at this session. Very interesting. And thank you, Vikram, for joining us. And all the audience joining us in such a large number. I think it's a great excitement for us. And obviously, I think, Vikram, your reputation precedes your, and it's very nice. So I think we have all these years, and even now, we keep on talking about China versus India, China versus the world, China versus, X, Y, Z. I think there is happening, but not enough discussion on what China and India and, and of course, occasionally it's spoken about, but we are not dive deep into that subject. And I'm sure, I think there is so much to do in the world. All said and done, China has also done some of the great things and taken the world over in many ways. And at this point in time, I think it is important to put all of our strengths together and see what can we do together rather than what can we do against each other. I think you have a huge, I would rather say, information base and also deep insight into the whole South Asian economy. And it would be wonderful to have, have you speak to everybody. People are very curious and very anxious to know. And we all have a role to play. If you can get perspective from you, that will be wonderful. So we are all anxious to hear, and thank you, Vivek, Ruchir, and everybody on the panel, Vaibhav. It must be in the middle of night. You are in New York, I know. And the best time is for Singapore. Vivek has a good evening time. So let's have a nice discussion and hopefully interactive as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you, Nishith bhai. Yes, we chose the time selfishly, but Vaibhav very ably said that no matter what time it is done, he will join, and that is typical. Let me dive straight into the questions, Vikram. Everyone's waiting to hear from you. I'm going to put across a couple of themes to you, and then you can dive straight into your perspectives. I know you've discussed things a number of times with a number of people. We're, as Nishith said, everyone's talking about anti-China sentiment globally. India too has come out with certain regulations recently talking about how they're going to deal with China. Singapore has had a very close relationship with China and a very close relationship with the United States for a number of years. And every day I read in the newspapers, Singapore is deftly handling both these relationships extremely well without getting baited into one side or the other. So what's the state of the global economy today, Vikram? And I would like you to focus a little bit on India and on China independently, and then your thoughts on what you see as the future after COVID. What role do India and China have in the economic landscape going forward? Then
Okay, thank you, Vivek, and thank you, Nishith bhai. I had the pleasure of meeting you many years ago in Singapore, and I think this is a great thing you're doing by way of knowledge sharing with a huge audience. Although we cannot see them, but I hope they're there and listening to us. Okay, I mean, I'll divide my comments into three broad sections according to Vivek's guidelines. One is the global economy. then I will move to the situation in India as I see it. Of course, many of you are in India, so you are closer to the ground, but I'll give my perspective from here. And then I'll give some perspective on the situation in China, which is slightly different. And then we'll move to discussing India-China possibilities of cooperation, etc. Okay, on the global economy, I think it's now well established that we are facing the greatest recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. In fact, some people say this should be called the Greater Recession, Greater Depression, right? It's probably the biggest economic event of our lifetime, certainly of my lifetime. First of all, it's a catastrophic health event. I mean, we have almost 4 million infections globally, something like 300,000 deaths, and there's no cure or vaccine in sight, right? And a lot of activity has just come to a sudden stop, right? Output has collapsed pretty much all over the world. The IMF projects that global growth will be -3% this year, -3% compared to +3% last year, which is a swing of 6 percentage points in 1 year, which is never happened in my experience. Advanced economies are shrinking by 6%. World trade, according to the WTO, could collapse by as much as 32% this year. We're going to have massive unemployment, bankruptcies, financial stress. We could probably see a lot of social unrest. There's also going to be a litigation epidemic. There's going to be massive litigation. So there's a silver lining in it for the lawyers. I think there's a lot of, after every crisis, there's a sort of huge jump in litigation and all kinds of legal lawsuits. So that's a broad global picture. In India, the situation from here, it looks pretty dire, at least according to the numbers. Numbers from March were auto sales down 50%, exports down 35%, steel production down 25%. That was in March. That was actually before. Most of it was before the lockdown. The April numbers are going to be even worse. The PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, which is a forward-looking index of activity to come. Above 50 shows an expansion in activity. Below 50 shows contraction in activity. For manufacturing, the PMI is 27 for April. For services, I had to do a double take when I saw this. It's 5.4 to be exact. I mean, compared to 49 just before, right? So it's an absolute collapse. 2/3 of companies are expecting sales to contract in the coming year. I think about a quarter of small and medium enterprises, micro, small and medium enterprises, may not be able to survive this crisis. Now, this is a huge sector which employs about more than 120 million people in India. It accounts for about 1/3 of output, almost half of exports. So this is going to be a huge supply shock. On top of that, the foreign worker remittances have also collapsed because a lot of workers, especially those in the Gulf, their wages have just stopped. So bottom line, I expect that India will be lucky to get even 0% growth this year. The IMF projects 1.9% growth, but I think it doesn't take into account the lockdown or the extension. And so that looks a bit optimistic to me. There will be huge fiscal and financial stress. I think India's fiscal deficit is already 4.4% for the year just passed, the end of 31st of March. So the government's target of 3.5% of GDP fiscal deficit is already history. I think for the year to come as a whole, it could balloon to as % of GDP if you include the states, right? Mainly because there's been a collapse in revenue, right? The GST collections are down, the growth is going to be down, and the whole privatization program has to be on hold, has to be put on hold. We're not going to be able to sell stakes in LIC, Air India, and the banks at this time, right? So what's been happening on the expenditure side? It's a bit surprising to me that we have not really seen any major action by the government. We had a small stimulus package of 1.7 trillion rupees, that's 0.7% of GDP, right? Which is mainly help for people who've lost jobs, some cash payments to workers, some food support, some small help to SMEs. Now, the Reserve Bank of India has done something. I mean, they have cut interest rates, they have injected liquidity into the system. They have opened a repo facility with the banks to lend to mutual funds and non-bank financial companies. But there's been a poor take-up. Basically, banks are just sitting on the cash. The RBI has also frozen asset classification. That means you can't classify loans as having turned bad at this time. There's a moratorium on loan repayments for 3 months, which I believe might be extended. And so the RBI has done something. As I mentioned, the banks are sitting on a mountain of surplus cash, right? Something like 8 lakh crores, 8 trillion rupees. Now they're depositing it with the RBI under the so-called reverse repo scheme, repo facility, which enables them to earn 3.75%, just putting the money with the RBI. And there are a lot of people who are saying that, look, they should be lending this money out into the economy. So you should make the reverse repo interest rate 0. So the banks have an incentive to sort of extend out credit and increase lending to the economy. What can be done on the fiscal side? I mean, there's a debate about this in India. I think we look around the rest of the world, we see massive fiscal boosts all over the place. I mean, the Federal Reserve, the US has done, I think, more than 3 trillion now, which is like 15% of GDP. A lot of countries have done at least 10% of GDP. You look at Japan, you look at UK, you look at Singapore. Even the EU has done a huge fiscal stimulus, a little less than the others, but huge enough. Now there are some people who suggest that India should do something similar, that we should also go all out. But the problem is that our fiscal deficit is already high, and if it goes much higher, we face the danger of a credit rating downgrade. I think the credit rating agencies have already cautioned that India should be careful with its fiscal deficit, and it is on course for a downgrade. They've already downgraded the outlook. So if the downgrade does happen, what would that do? That would prevent the institutional funds from investing in Indian bonds and so on, and including sovereign bonds, and that will raise borrowing costs for India. So that's a hazard. I mean, that's undoubtedly a hazard. But on balance, I mean, I discussed this with some people who were former government advisors in India, and I think they also agree that on balance, we probably will get a credit rating downgrade anyway, because our fiscal deficit, whatever we do, is going to blow out. So we may as well go for maximum support. I mean, let's do what it takes to bring the economy back on its feet. We are facing an economic emergency. I mean, this is like a war. I mean, you have to do what it takes. If you don't do it, I mean, you risk mass social unrest, mass unemployment, mass misery. And in that case, the fiscal deficit will just go completely crazy. So I think we are not choosing between good and bad. We're choosing between evils here. So I think, I don't know where different people have different views. I think this is being an emergency. I think we should go the full distance. How should the money be spent? I think the top priority is, of course, to protect the sort of poorest and the weakest segments. You pump more money into bank accounts through the Jan Dhan Yojana. They've already started doing that. You increase allocations for Manrega, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which were cut in the last budget, to my surprise. You buy crops from farmers. I mean, you have to pump money into the hands of the people at the poorest level. But, you should also send a signal that this is temporary, and that this is a temporary departure from fiscal prudence, and you should have some kind of indication of how you're going to come back from this. So you don't want to say that this is going to be a permanent state of affairs. It's not. You still maintain a prudent stance. You're just making a temporary departure. Then India also needs to do something to save its companies. I mean, there are many possibilities here. One is a special purpose vehicle, SPV, to buy corporate bonds, or the Reserve Bank could buy corporate bonds itself. For SMEs, you need to do something. You could do what some other countries are doing. You could have longer loan repayment moratoriums. You could have increases in working capital loans. You could have government guaranteed loans to the extent of 70%, at least for those SMEs that were profitable before the crisis. right? I mean, they become unprofitable not through any fault of their own, but because of this force majeure kind of situation that's come up. Of course, there are hazards in all this. You can imagine the cronyism and so on that will happen when when you're sort of guaranteeing loans to small companies. But what is the alternative? I mean, the alternative is to let them collapse. So I think we have to put up with certain amount of cronyism and so on. That is going to happen in India. Another alternative which some economists have discussed in the Singapore context, which might be applicable in India, is an SPV to take equity stakes in companies, right? At least the profitable companies that were profitable before the crisis. Now, these equity stakes can be unwound later on. The reason they are suggesting this is that if you just depend on loans, a lot of the companies will find it tough to pay back the loans, because when business comes back online, it's not going to kind of just suddenly switch on. I mean, it'll take a while. I mean, workers have to come back from their villages. There'll be social distancing. Companies will not be able to just take off where they left off, earlier. So it'll be a while. So I think you need longer help. So also the domestic supply chains will be disrupted. I mean, it's not only your company that must do all right. It's even your suppliers must do all right. If you don't have even one vital component, you can't ship your product. So I think all these things, companies are going to have a lot of problems even coming back online when the lockdown is lifted. Okay, so let me go to China a little bit now. It's a somewhat different story. They had a terrible first quarter. I mean, this 6.8% decline in GDP. But they've been able to come back online. They've been able to control the COVID-19, and factories are now operating at around 70% of capacity. So there's some rebound in industrial production, in retail sales, in fixed asset investments. So I think they are ahead of the curve, ahead of India on the curve. When it comes to policy, they've also done something similar to India. They have done much more on the monetary side. The Bank of China, the central bank, has cut interest rates. They've reduced reserve requirements, but they haven't done very much on the fiscal side. Very small fiscal stimulus, and the reason for this is that they have a very bad corporate debt situation already, so they don't want to add to that. So a second problem they have is that their exports have collapsed. I mean, basically, the export demand from the West has pretty much collapsed. So even though the factories are working, what are they going to? They're going to sell to? They can only sell mostly to the domestic market. The export markets are totally down. The third problem that China is facing is the COVID-19 has accelerated the shift of supply chains out of China. Now, this was happening anyway during the Cold War. I mean, the trade war, which is also a Cold War. Because a lot of companies decided that they didn't want to put all their eggs in one basket. They didn't want to concentrate their production in China. But now the COVID-19 situation has made companies realize that they have to build redundancies in their supply chains. That means they have to hold inventories. They have to diversify their sources of supply. So a lot of the supply chains are being splintered. Some is going to Thailand, some is going to Vietnam, some is going to Malaysia, etc. Some has actually also gone to India, right? Now, India could get some of this business. And I believe that India has set aside lots of land in a few states to bring in supply chain business from China that leaves China. I think they're targeting something like 1,000 companies to switch to India. I think that's plausible. But I think if we were to do that, I think India needs to change its whole focus in manufacturing. This Make in India policy is frankly not working. I think we need to pivot to a policy of assemble in India, where we do not make the whole thing in India. We do not have the whole supply chain in India. We only assemble components, just like what China did. This is how Chinese manufacturing took off. They basically became a center of supply chains. A lot of the components came from multiple countries. We can do the same thing. We can manufacture a lot of components. We're very good at in certain areas, pharmaceuticals, auto parts, and so on. We can easily become a major part of the manufacturing supply chain. Now, but in order to sort of make the most of that, I think we would need to rethink our approach to joining international agreements, like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a trade agreement that will probably be signed this year, despite everything. It's a trade agreement between 10 ASEAN countries, as well as China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. I mean, India dithered for a long time and then decided not to join. But I think we need to reconsider that. I think we want to be part of the supply chain network in Asia, which is going to happen, which is already here. I think we need to think about joining it. I'm not, our fears are, I think, somewhat misplaced. I remember before 1991, before the economic crisis of 1991, a lot of people would say, no, we can never open up, we'll be swamped and but what happened? We opened up, and in fact, our economy boomed after that. Our economy took off. I mean, we became more efficient, we adapted. And I think the same thing will happen. I think there will be some disruption, but I think in the end, we'll be better off. Then you mentioned, Vivek, you mentioned the whole issue of Chinese investment in India. Now, India has said it will screen investments from countries with land borders, that India has land borders with. So, of course, this is obviously targeted at China because we don't get very much investment from Bhutan or Nepal or Pakistan or Bangladesh, and some of these countries are already being screened. So I understand the rationale. I think, India wants to prevent opportunistic takeovers by Chinese companies of Indian companies at probably attractive valuations. I see that. But I still have some issues. I mean, for one thing, you're just targeting one country. I mean, the new directive doesn't apply to countries that do not have a land border. So opportunistic investments from Europe or United States or Southeast Asia is fine, but from China they're not, which is, I think, a bit strange. I think I also wonder if it's compliant with the WTO regulations, where you can't discriminate between countries. I think China believes that it is not. It is non-compliant. And I fear that they might be right. I don't know this. This is for the lawyers to say. The second problem I have is that Indian companies are already starved of capital, right? I mean, at this time, I think if any capital comes into the country, it should be welcome. Of course, you have to keep it out of sensitive sectors. You keep it out of telecoms. You keep it out of banking, maybe. You keep it out of whatever sectors India considers sensitive. But you don't have a sort of wholesale ban on investments, a wholesale screening of every little investment that comes in. There are several other problems. I mean, investments can come in through consortia. It's not just only Chinese. It may be Chinese money, some American money, some European money, some Southeast Asian money. So what's going to happen to those investments? I think the lawyers in this panel would have some light to throw on that. So, already Chinese are heavily invested in Indian startups. I think 18 out of 24 Indian unicorns have Chinese investments. All the familiar names, Flipkart, Ola, Paytm, all these have Chinese investments. And I don't see what damage that has done to India. In fact, I think it's been a benefit all around. And I think China can also bring in a lot of technology. I mean, they're technology leaders in things like AI, big data, IoT. We need all that stuff. And I think we can get it. We can get it if we open up to China with safeguards. We have to have safeguards, but we can't have a sort of blanket rule saying no, every single investment is going to be screened. So at a minimum, I think the government should make clear what the criteria are. I suspect that the lawyers in the panel will throw more light on this. So overall, I think, China and India should try to work together during this crisis. I think we need each other more. We are already interdependent. I mean, a lot of inputs in Indian industry come from China. A lot of the pharmaceutical basic materials, in fact, the majority of them come from China. And China could also help build India's infrastructure. They have excess capacity now, having built their own infrastructure. They have great companies who build roads, high-speed rail, you name it, power stations, whatever it is. And we have an infrastructure deficit. I think there are obvious complementarities. Certainly, I think India should restrict investment in sensitive areas. And this is a matter for intelligent regulation. But I think we should be pragmatic on the rest. We should welcome other investments. And at the same time, of course, I think China needs to open up to Indian exports as well. India's exporters like pharmaceutical manufacturers have a tough time getting entry into China, getting approval. These are mainly non-tariff barriers. But these are things that can be negotiated. So by and large, I think we should try and work out a win-win arrangement rather than being driven by ideology. We should be driven by pragmatism. And I think now at this time we are the two largest economies, most populous economies among the largest economies in Asia. And I think this time we need to come together. So I'll stop there, Vivek. If you have further questions, I'll take them later. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Vikram. I mean, that was super enlightening for all of us. I think you talked about intelligent regulation. The time is ripe for intelligent regulation. I like the way you put that. And maybe I'll take that to you, Ruchir. We have an intelligent regulation deficit at times in India as well. We have obviously the infamous Press Note 3, what Vikram was referring to as screening of all investments from China predominantly. A lot has been discussed on that. I believe there are discussions going on with the government as well on how to define beneficial ownership. But given what Vikram has just said, that India and China need to really work together, find ways to do things together in this current environment. What have you been noticing on the ground in India as far as Chinese investment into India? What some of your clients who may have a Chinese LP, how are they reacting? Suggest that they are par for the course, or are they reacting to pull the money out and invest it somewhere else? If you could just throw some light on some of the commercial and practical things that you're seeing.
Yeah, no. So I think first, Vikram, thank you very much. This was a very enlightening perspective that you gave, and I like the way, completely agree with Vivek, the way you put it as intellectual or intelligent regulation, and we clearly seem to have a deficit of it. And I think the other perspective that at this point in time, when the projections for 1.9% GDP growth, assuming that we are outside the corona crisis by May end, I think the Indian government should clearly be taking any capital that comes its ways, unless of course we are able to avoid the crisis by May 31st, which doesn't seem to be the case. So therefore, I think a negative growth, as you said, is likely. And it is on that count that Press Note 3, which came in, and the two paragraphs of that Press Note 3 have created more ambiguity than ever. And it's sort of been very intriguing for me personally and for a lot of Chinese investors that were investing in India. It seemed to be, at least it seemed to the market as an aftermath of what happened, when some of the Chinese corporations bought stake into publicly listed companies in India like the HDFC, etc. And I think the world over, the European Union, Australia, etc., started getting more protective and started realizing that their companies are more vulnerable at this time, and therefore Chinese companies and state-owned corporations which are sitting with huge war chests of money should be precluded from investing, at least at this time of vulnerability. I think it was that background in which we were indeed expecting some degree of regulation coming in. But strangely enough, the regulation that came in Press Note 3 does not even touch the public listed or the public equity space. It actually only regulates Chinese investments in a very euphemistically drafted regulation. It doesn't name China, but says that countries sharing borders investing in India will require approval. I think it creates sort of ambiguities on two counts, and which have given, I believe, a lot of intellectual stimulation to an otherwise insipid ecosystem at this point in time, and lawyers are enjoying their way through, in throwing up different permutations on how to interpret the Press Note. I think the Press Note really applies on two counts. One is on a direct basis. So if you are a Chinese entity, straitjacket, investing into India, clearly even a one share investment requires the approval. I think there is no doubt about that. The doubt really comes, or the ambiguity really comes, when you start determining what is indirect sort of ownership. The press note and the attendant regulations that were drafted in what we call as the non-debt investment rules sets out the parameter which is called as beneficial ownership. And interestingly so, and in their own the typical regulatory overture, they have not chosen to define what beneficial ownership means. Now, a beneficial ownership could have possibly, there are different meanings, but possibly there could be three interpretations that could be taken. One is under the common law jurisprudence, we use it in tax, etc. Who's the beneficial owner? And that's really a sort of an anti-sham kind of a provision. So if you are really using an entity as a conduit, then someone could really lift the veil and say, the person behind that entity, if it's entirely Chinese, then it's really a Chinese investment. That could be one way, but that's a very high threshold for determining beneficial ownership. And at least from tax jurisprudence, it has been very, very difficult to establish that. I think the other jurisprudence of beneficial ownership comes from the perspective of the Companies Act, where you try to determine whether a holding company is indeed Chinese owned or not. And there again, the Companies Act Section 90, as we, under which we have the beneficial ownership rules, sets out the principle of what we call as majority stake, which means that if you are not really owning a majority stake, which means a 50% ownership of equity or voting, you would typically not be said to be a beneficial owner. So again, that should be, that's again a very high threshold. And then there's a third threshold generally, which is under what we call as a SEBI ultimate beneficial ownership threshold, or the PMLA threshold, so to say. And this threshold looks at a 25% ownership threshold. So either it looks at a control test, or it looks at a 25% voting, or it looks at a 25% equity ownership test. And this is where it gets sort of complicated, particularly for the fund industry. And, it's actually, I think I was just discussing, with a few people and also with you, Vivek, earlier, that, it's only in the course of last year that we actually saw significant Chinese money coming in, the likes of Tencent, Fosun, and a lot of smaller Chinese players like Alpine and all these people. And these poor people were, anticipating that there has to be, there might be some anti-China reaction, were donating huge levels of anti-COVID, COVID testing kits and so on to develop goodwill. But nothing seemed to have worked. And the Indian government probably brought about a regulation which not only impacts, simpliciter or Chinese money, but also GPs which are based out of Hong Kong, because Hong Kong, for its own tax reasons, is a great jurisdiction from a GP perspective. So unfortunately, that is now affected. Second is any LP money, which is sort of coming into blind pool funds, is also coming into question. The jury is still out, whether it is 25% or 10% or even 1%. And, people are enjoying their way through. And some authorized dealers are saying that, even a 1% Chinese interest in a blind pool fund can actually require approval. So what happens? And I'm absolutely intrigued, how that will work, because all the Blackstones and the Brookfields and the Carlyles who are who are effectively US-owned GPs may have some degree of Chinese money, and that money, if they all get subjected to Chinese approval without any respective threshold, can't really be called into question. There is some hint that the government might be coming up with a new threshold of 15%. I don't know where are they conjuring up those numbers from thin air, but that'll be pretty interesting. I think the way I look at this is really, it is not the approval that is bothering. It is not the approval. It is never the approval. I think the question really is the complete uncertainty around the approval. Whom do you apply to? We earlier had the Foreign Investment Promotion Board that was, that was taken away. So now they said that, you should go to the respective sectoral regulator. Now, who's the sectoral regulator? This has actually come at the back of the Ministry of Home. So should you be approaching your sectoral regulator? Let's say if you're investing in tech industry, should you be going to the tech ministry? Plus you should be going to the Ministry of Home Affairs. Plus you should be going to the Ministry of Finance. I think there is so much ambiguity around it that one thing is very clear, that if you go to take an approval, I think it will take a lot of time, and this will not be on the top priority for the government. I hear that for private fund managers, the government is trying to do something, because it's really rubbed the wrong way. This was never the intent. I think we are actually facing some issues in transactions where, like say it was a Series C or a Series D investment. There were one Chinese investor and there were multiple other American or European investors. And because the Chinese investor requires approval, and you can't really go ahead without his approval, and you want and they would ensure simultaneous closings, the whole transaction has been stuck. And stuck for how long? So at a time when we really needed capital, you have actually deprived India of that capital. And not just, as you said, on the basis of some intelligent regulation. You did it for infrastructure, you did it for certain sensitive sectors. It could have been understood. You did it for public equity market, which was rather unregulated, which were not restricted, so to say, because any investor can just come and buy as much stock. That has not been, the RBI says that they are taking a closer look, and SEBI is going to take a closer look, but that's still not restricted, where the vulnerabilities really exist. But the restriction has really been brought into the FDI space, which is really private. And again, it is not impacted sort of another routes of private investment like the foreign venture capital investment. So I think a lot of ambiguities and seems to be like a knee-jerk reaction. But having said that, lawyers always have a tendency to criticize the government. Obviously, they have their own sort of considerations on this. But Vikram, I think my question to you, and sorry for the long sort of prelude to this, is that how do you see? India is at a time when we really needed the capital, when we are heading towards possibly negative economic growth. We are really thwarting away capital which was coming in, a large amount of capital, and then especially in areas where we needed, tech and all that. Where do you think, one is, do you think that it was wiser for the Indian government to do this? And I think a lot of other economies are doing it, in similar manner. And where will this capital now go? Will it be, I think you indicated Vietnam, Thailand, etc. So what do you see the implications of?
Well, thanks, Ruchir. I think you made some very interesting points. One is that it's not only Chinese investors that will be affected by this. It is also non-Chinese investors if they come in as part of a consortium or something, right? So you're blocking out not only Chinese investment, you're probably blocking out a lot of non-Chinese investment. The second thing is, as you mentioned, the public markets investment is not affected. The portfolio flows are not affected. It's only the FDI, the foreign direct investment, that's affected. Now, this happens to be longer term investment. Portfolio investment is short term. It can come in and go out 2 weeks later. But foreign direct investment stays for the long term. I think that is the kind of investment we need. As for, the Europe and the US, they have really sensitive technologies, right? They have semiconductors, they have high-end technologies that they want to preserve. Now, I can understand if we had those technologies also, there is a case to be made that we should protect them and we should not allow these to be taken over. But this is not where the Chinese investors are interested in coming in. They are coming in very simple areas. They're coming in and they're even investing in automobiles. There's this company called Great Wall Motors or something, which has huge investments in automobiles. They want to invest in pharmaceuticals. These should not be sensitive sectors. They want to invest in infrastructure. They want to come and build roads. They want to bid for high-speed trains. Now, why should we prevent that? Even I don't think the Europeans and the Americans are doing that. They are allowing Chinese investments in these kind of areas. If they want to build hotels, fine, go ahead. But okay, fine, you define your sensitive sectors. This is a matter for intelligent regulation. You say, all right, ports, no, we don't want in ports. I think it's okay, but maybe there's a case to be made that you shouldn't. Maybe telecoms, you don't want. Okay, fine. Defense, obviously, you don't want. Fine. Banking, you should not. Okay, there should be a limit. You can define. This is a matter for regulation. What I find puzzling is this sort of blanket rule that all investments, any investments in any industry will be screened, will be subject to approval and uncertainty. So that is the problem that I have.
Thanks, Vikram, and thanks, Ruchir. Vaibhav, I know you've been waiting and Vaibhav, welcome from New York. Could be said currently the epicenter of COVID-19, though I hear things are coming under control. It would be great to hear your perspective, Vaibhav. We have talked about India, China. You're sitting there, ear to the ground. The US and China have their own trade war going on. Trump has something to say every day on how he's going to fix China. What are you hearing on the ground, and how do you see this from an India perspective? There is also talk about the US trying to rope in India into some sort of alliance, anti-China alliance, including trying to attract companies out of China. So your getting perspectives would be great, and if you could also touch upon some of the impact this is happening on the technology sector, where India is heavily dependent on US markets. And the Chinese market.
Thank you, Vivek. I'm cognizant of time restrictions, so I will try to be brief because what you said, I think we can talk for ages, right?
You can take 10 minutes. I have few questions. So you've joined us very early in the morning.
Perfect. Okay, perfect. So Vivek, I will focus on technology first, and then I will go into the US situation, what I'm hearing sitting in New York. I really feel, I really like to think the way Nishith Bhai thinks. What if, India and China works together? What if there is, all this, what you call utopia situation, right? Where people are not concerned. I think there is a great synergy between India and China. India has fantastic software engineering capability. China has a lot of hardware capability. China is far ahead in developing intellectual property. I think they filed the largest number of patents this year, and they overtook US. I think for the first time, or maybe one of the times when they overtook US on filing patents. So China has come a far way from being considered to be, someone who would steal somebody's technology to developing their own technology, right? So it's a fantastic opportunity to have intellectual property, hardware, production capability, software engineering put together. More importantly, both India and China, there's a lot of synergy in data because, being the two largest populous country, the amount of data which they generate are tremendous. And when you look at artificial intelligence or AI, and what I hear from people is that, let's say 10 years down the line or 15 years down the line, 80% plus companies will be using AI as their key strategy, and every individual would be affected by AI, whether it is, customer surveys or scheduling their appointment or anything like that, right? So AI is so critical. And China obviously is far ahead in AI than India. But if you really look at this synergy from data perspective, there's a huge synergy which is available. So a lot of technologies which China and India can do together, with India providing on the software engineering side and China providing on the intellectual property and on manufacturing side, right? Having said it, let me go and look at today's reality, and unfortunately, that's not the situation. There are trust issues between India and China, between China and rest of the world, and I will touch upon that shortly. But let me address some of the technologies and try to see what is happening, right? And I'll take AI first. I think AI is very critical. I think every country is looking at developing AI capability. India has realized that while they don't have that intellectual property, but they do have a data, and because they have a data, it can be a great attractor for investment in developing AI technologies. We are seeing a lot of startups in India already developing different applications and technologies with respect to AI. The deep tech has started coming up in India right now. What should have happened 20 years ago, or what we saw in other countries 20 years ago, India is now seeing that situation. So AI is something where India needs to lead. India has an ability to lead, but China is already far ahead in the game, from not just from India but rest of the world. Now this is where US comes in, and US is believing that if India and US kind of team up together in AI field, then they can look at kind of giving an alternative to what Chinese technology is, because US, while it has the data, it requires a lot more data which India can give, and US believes that they have a lot of technology and capital which they can put it in. So AI is one area where we are going to see a lot of interesting developments, and what do I call, whether it's a trade war or whether it is how things are going to go up on technologies which are developed in China versus technology which are developed outside China. I think that's where there will be a lot of activity. So this is the area to watch for next few years. The other area other technology area which definitely comes to my mind is 5G. 5G is very interesting because 5G is an infrastructure which will enable a lot of other areas, including AI, IoT, smart cities. When you talk about all those very interesting application, it requires that backbone. It requires high speed. It requires having be able to address multiple IP addresses, for which you can have 50,000 or 50 million sensors or 50 billion sensors, which world is predicting and IoT will require. Now, if you want to have 50 billion sensors which are connected, you need that many IP addresses. Current technology does not provide that many capabilities. So 5G is kind of a backbone for doing anything, and I'm definitely clear that while it's going to take some time because of the economic issues, it requires a lot of investment. It has a lot of work to do. Let me put it this way. And in fact, we are having a session on 5G just six hours later. So if anybody is interested, please join. So I will not go into those details. But while it requires a lot of work to do, it's a great backbone. It will become kind of a platform or a foundation on which a lot of things are based. Now there's a huge fight on how that foundation, who is going to develop that foundation. China is far ahead compared to other countries, and US is very worried. The US has passed a law also which says secure 5G, and Beyond Act, which basically they want to prevent Chinese technologies to come into the US, because there are two kinds of worries. One worry is that Chinese will, Chinese government, because most of this technology is having government. They will actually take away all the information which is being passed through it. And the second worry is that tomorrow, if there is let's say a war or something like that, then those technology can be turned off or can be used as weapon against the country in which it is deployed. So there's a lot of sensitivity in using that particular infrastructure. But there is maybe no option. This 5G has to come in. So there always people will need to make a call on how that needs to be developed. Also, newer technologies are coming in 5G also, where there's an approach which people are trying to do, which they call fully virtualized mobile network, where they are saying it's hardware agnostic. Because in normal 5G, if you take hardware from one company, you're locked in, which means you cannot go in and replace it very easily. That's why you're dependent on it. And that's where the whole security issue comes in. But in this new technology, which is also being pursued, where they are making hardware agnostic and they're using software to kind of make different hardware works together in the same way how cloud computing works. So that's where again India can play a major role in coming up, because software engineering has been India's forte for a long time, to come up and help that new approach, which will make world less worried about the 5G security coming in. I have 2 more minutes, so I will just talk now about the US-China thing a little bit. I think everybody is reading newspaper, and President Trump here has said that coronavirus is an act of war in an indirect way. They call it an attack, and they are blaming China. This time, and this is the trade war with US has been happening for some time now, right? And President Trump has not been pro-China and it's very evident, and have been trying to push China, quite a bit on trade front. But with this happening, it has actually become a lot more, real. Let me put it this way: it's not just a positioning, but has become a lot more real. It has also got support directly or indirectly. Some countries have openly come up, some countries have not come up. We are seeing Germany talking about filing a suit against China, or asking China to pay damages. You've seen Australia questioning on investigation on where is the origin. So there are a lot of other countries some have come out, many have not come out. But what I hear is that there is support which President Trump will have externally if he takes a leadership. Now again, we'll see what happens in November, because we may have him, we may not have him. Things which were so certain that he will come are no longer looking certain. But assuming he comes back, or assuming someone who comes back is similar to him, you are actually going to see a great kind of a war, Cold War, which will have a lot more partners, or lot many people will actually support because of what they are facing right now. So China will have a tough time in trying to manage the public relationships. We don't know today; it's going to be just temporary for a couple of years, or it's going to be a long term. But with US, it seems to be a long term thing. Now that will definitely throw a challenge as well as an opportunity for India, and that's something which Indian government will need to think how best to position themselves and take benefit of that particular activity. With this, I think my time is up. I can go on and on, but I will leave it to go back to you, Vivek.
Thanks so much, Vaibhav. I think that was a
Vivek,
great perspective. I think technology. Can you hear me now? Am I audible?
I can.
Yeah.
So I think technology, Vaibhav, is going to play a very key role in everything that we have talked about on this panel, right? How 5G is going to be utilized, who controls the technology behind 5G. Vikram talked about AI. I think all of this is going to have a profound impact on India, China, and everything that's going to impact the global economy. There are a few questions. We don't have time for all of them, but Vikram, maybe I'll There's a question about what are some of the on-ground problems in India?
We haven't seen much investment coming to India even at the time of US-China trade war earlier. Most of them went to Vietnam, Thailand, etc. Your opinion, what are the on-ground problems in spite of so much favorable policy reforms in India? Essentially, she's trying to figure out what is the regulatory tackles here that don't, despite all of this, India is not able to attract as much of the foreign investment.
Okay. I think India has several problems with respect to attracting this kind of investment. One is the classic one. The one is land acquisition. I mean, a lot of investors, even Indian investors, let alone foreign investors, have had problems acquiring large-scale land for factories, for setting up factories and so on, facilities. The other is labor laws. I think our labor laws are very archaic. We have something like 40 state and center labor laws. I think they are working on reforms. It's very difficult to shed workers, to let go of workers. Above, I think 100, you have to take special permission and so on. So that's another deterrent. Third one is skills. I think we lack a lot of the skills that are needed for at least the high value added kind of production that China does, that even Vietnam is now able to do. The fourth, of course, is infrastructure. I mean, the ports, the roads, the power system, the reliability, the internal transport systems. And the fifth is regulation. I mean, I think a lot of the regulations that you pointed out are very unclear. We don't know. I mean, investors are not very clear on what they can do, what they cannot. So I think these are some of the problems on the ground in India. But I think the other countries are also having some problems. So, for example, in Vietnam, most of the capacity is taken up. I mean, it's hard to find now even labor. They can't scale up. I mean, they're incapable of scaling. It's hard to find land. It's hard to find labor. It's hard. Even they're short of skills. So you cannot just move everything out of China. I mean, it'll take several years for that to happen. But I think India can, if it changes some of its regulations, if it does something, make land acquisition easier, makes labor laws a little more business friendly, and regulations a little more transparent, I think it can attract quite a bit of investment.
Thank you, everyone. I hope I'm audible now. I think Vikram, thanks so much for joining us. And Nishith bhai, if you want to say last few words, we have a minute left.
Oh, thank you so much. I think Indian stretchable time 1 minute is good enough, no problem. But I think it was very interesting discussion. One thing I feel where we are not talked enough is on services. I think that is where India has strength. Almost 60-70% of India is today service economy. And there are so many different services we can identify, which we haven't really applied our mind to. Should polish chain. Okay, as I mentioned, even the drones. You talked about assembly line. It's more, in my view, it's more of a service than just manufacturing. And banking, or take any services. India has software services. Technology is all about services. AR, VR, for example, or tourism, okay, is one part, but in future tourism would be on AR, VR. Developing those programs. Vivek, you have been focusing on education. So I think there is a lot of trade that could happen between services and goods, and that is where I think we should strategically be thinking as to what services we can export to China. China can come. So both are interdependent. And when there is interdependency, there is less reason to fight, and there is more reason to find out synergies and complementarity. Because otherwise, this will become we compete and we versus they, versus we and they. I think is very important. That would be one perspective. And second thing, I'm also thinking. I have posed a small question as to how is the lifestyle going to change post-pandemic. I think all of us have learned to be minimalistic, and we know that what do we need basically in life. I think if that culture also developed, that would reduce the cost of living. It will possibly, improve the family life. It will improve, dependency on the. It will decrease the pollution, because we can have the cars not coming on the street. Will make a lot of difference. I think more and more people are looking at technology, want to connect and talk and meet and all that thing. So if we really apply our mind on services plus understand that basic living, if it comes down, then what we used to talk about at one point of time, basic minimum wage, right? Even that also should theoretically come down, because you don't have a travel cost, for example. You do not have a cost of, excessive consumption and stuff like that. So maybe we might want to look at the whole scene in next few months' time as to what is it that ultimately a human being needs, and that is what we need to provide to people. As you say, food, shelter, and clothes, the basic ones, and what does it need, We have enough resources and we have other, people to contribute, and we have to figure out how to go about. I don't want to go too long because it's already more than a minute. But thank you so much. Wonderful listening to you, Vikram, and Ruchir, your comments. Excellent. Vaibhav, thanks a lot for getting up in the middle of night. And Vivek, wonderful moderation. I really am very happy that we all came together and thought about these issues. There's a lot more better things to come in the future. Let's be hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Vikram. Thanks for joining us. Weber can get some sleep.